All right, those in the UK are growing weary of the Brexit battle, and it may be shifting the political landscape in favor of Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The Wall Street Journal reports there are nearly 160 Labour-held districts that voted to leave the EU, and at least 40 to 50 of them are vulnerable to swing to Conservatives. According to recent polls, the Conservative Party leads Labour by at least 9 points, while Johnson's approval rating has increased since his nomination as leader, increasing the chances of a possible flip. Joining us now, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron. He is the author of the new book, For the Record. Thank you very much for being on this morning.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for being with us. And despite those poll numbers, Boris Johnson, a man you knew at Eton and Oxford, may be facing a no-confidence vote in Parliament. Will he survive that? Should he survive that?
Well, I think what ought to happen next is Prime Minister Boris Johnson should go to Brussels and try and negotiate a withdrawal agreement with the European Union. That's what he's planning to do in the middle of October, and he should bring that back to the UK Parliament, and I hope that deal will pass. And while I continue to believe that we've taken the wrong step with Brexit, I led the campaign to stay in, the referendum result was clear and it should be delivered, and the best way to deliver it is with a deal, and I hope that's what's going to happen.
So what odds do you give no-deal Brexit of actually taking place, something that Prime Minister Johnson has been pushing for since he ascended to his position?
Well, the central fact about British politics at the moment is the government doesn't have a majority in Parliament, and Parliament has legislated to try and put a no-deal Brexit out of bounds. So the real choice is to get a deal, as I hope Boris Johnson will, or to find another way of unblocking the blockage. It's very painful to watch, and I feel some responsibility for the situation we're in. We've had 3 years where we haven't been able to either implement the outcome of the referendum or move on. So I think the first step is to try and get that deal. If we can't get the deal, I wouldn't advise no deal. I think it could be economically damaging and damaging to the United Kingdom. And we'll have to look at other ways of unblocking the blockage, possibly a general election, as your package referred to, or there is the option of a second referendum, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily want, but we can't go on for many more months as we are now with neither going forwards nor backwards.
So we want to get to your book and what you say about Brexit and what led to it. But before we do that, maybe you can help us out, because for 3 years now, as you said, the United Kingdom has been paralyzed by Brexit. Anytime we go over there and start rolling our eyes about our government, we'll have people saying, well, that's just one man. You will vote him out in time. But it is our system that seems to be incapable of being fixed. Explain to the American audience, why is it that after 3 years, Parliament can't move forward, make a decision, and stick to it?
Well, I think part of the problem is in 2015 I won a small majority, and so had a majority in Parliament and was able to pass the referendum bill through, and actually 9 out of 10 MPs from a range of parties voted for that bill. But in 2017 there was an election where effectively the government lost its majority, and one of the reasons it's been so difficult to go forward is we have a Parliament without a clear majority. And you know, when you're in that situation, you have to reach across the aisles, as you'd say here in the United States, and find support for your proposition from other members of Parliament, and that hasn't really happened. And so my successor as Prime Minister, Theresa May, did a great job in getting a deal from the EU in terms of us leaving the European Union with an agreement, but couldn't get that through Parliament because members of Parliament from other parties wouldn't vote for it. So that's why we're stuck. It is very frustrating. I mean, I'd take the opportunity on American television to say that, you know, the British economy is still strong. There's still a huge amount of inward investment. Our unemployment is the lowest it's been since the 1970s. Britain has still got a lot of advantages. And while I disagree with Brexit, it's a perfectly legitimate choice for the 6th largest economy in the world to say to the European Union, we want to be your friends, we want to be your partners and your neighbours, but we're not going to be members anymore. It's not the path I would have chosen, but it is a legitimate path and one we can make work.
Mr. Prime Minister, this is David Ignatius. I want to ask you a question that obviously is on our minds these days as we deal with American political problems. Do you think there's any possibility that Russian interference, Russian manipulation was a factor in this kind of train wreck of British politics 3 years ago that you're still struggling to deal with? Have you looked into that, and do you have a feeling about whether the Russians may have amplified the Leave sentiment and try to play on this populist moment?
It was looked into by a select committee of the House of Commons, and from memory, what they found is there was some activity, but I don't think anyone would say that it was in any way decisive. Look, obviously, I regret hugely the outcome of the referendum campaign, but as Prime Minister, I spent public taxpayers' money writing to every single household in the country with a leaflet, every word of which, I pored over carefully to put the argument about why we should stay. So I've never I complain about some individual bits of the campaign, and I detail that in my book. But generally speaking, it was, a rumbustious, as you'd expect in Britain, campaign. But I don't, claim that it was somehow unfair.
Mr. Prime Minister, there is a striking line in this book, which I'm not saying you did this for crisis management, but I would recommend to politicians to be as straightforward as you were in this one line. Of course, our American president will never take this tact, but you say on the Brexit fallout, you say, I accept that my approach failed. The decisions I took contributed to that failure. I failed. Very straightforward, very striking language. But you go on to talk about doing it despite the fact there didn't seem to be a clamoring for this vote. But you said still you believed it was, quote, inevitable. Why do you believe that this vote sooner or later was inevitable?
I believed it was inevitable because we had joined the EU back in the 1970s, but we'd had treaty after treaty, we'd have power after power passed from the UK to the European Union. Referendums kept being promised, but they were never being delivered. And then added to that, you had the development of the euro as the currency of some of the members of the EU, but not the UK. And that was changing the organisation before our very eyes. So we had to fix it. But the passage you read from the book is, look, my aim in fixing it was to use a referendum to trigger a renegotiation, to fix some of the genuine problems I saw, and then secure our place as a separate, different sort of British place in the European Union. And in that endeavour, obviously, I failed. And I'm full of regret for that, because I think the right answer was to stay in and to fight for a British position in Europe. But I accept the outcome of the referendum. There was a clamour for it back in 2012. 2/3 of voters supported it. 9 out of 10 MPs voted for it in the House of Commons. Actually, every political party in Britain at some stage between 2005 and 2015 went into an election promising a referendum. So there was a big public demand for it. But obviously I regret the outcome. But I think we can make the answer work, but we need to get out of this deadlock that we're in at the moment.
You're right about Boris Johnson, again, someone you've known since your days at Eton. And you suggest, make a suggestion that many are suggesting about the American president, that Boris Johnson, when it comes to Brexit, cares more about his own political future than the future of the country. Many others have also suggested that he cynically employed Brexit to help fuel his political rise. Explain the Boris Johnson that you've known for decades and the Boris Johnson that has emerged over the past 3 years, the difference between those two.
Well, the point I make in the book is that he hadn't previously argued for leaving the EU. I explained that he was a Eurosceptic. There was a lot about Brussels he didn't like, a lot about the system he didn't like, but he'd never argued for leaving. So I was passionately trying to convince him to argue for staying on the basis that staying and fighting for British interests was the best answer. But look, I want Boris to succeed as Prime Minister. He's got a vital job to do, getting that negotiation in Brussels. I worked with him very closely when he was Mayor of London. He was a very effective mayor. He can be, at his best, an effective politician, and I want him to succeed in sorting out this issue for Britain and also the other things that we need to do. Keep the economy growing, keep creating jobs, improve our public services, all those things that are so vital.
I want to end on a personal note. You talk about the loss of your son, Ivan, in 2009. He was 6 years old, and I ask this question because We all know parents that have to endure terrible loss, terrible hardship. It happened to you while you were in the public eye. You talk about it in the book, but how did you move forward through that tragedy?
Well, it was obviously extremely difficult because these things, when they hit you like a freight train at 100 miles an hour. And first, having a child with severe disabilities is not something you expect and not something you know how to cope with. And so that's hugely impactful. And then obviously losing him so young was heartbreaking. I wrote the chapter in the book because I wanted to talk about it, partly for myself, but partly because there are so many parents with disabled children who struggled as we struggled. And I think they will identify with some of the difficulties and the struggles that we went through. Going back to work afterwards was very difficult, and I think I say in the book I maybe went back to work a bit too quickly rather than spending some more time thinking it through. But it was, he was a divine, wonderful boy, and we loved him.
So as we read through For the Record, I'm curious, what takeaway would you want American audiences to have as they read For the Record?
Well, I hope what they'll see is, yes, an explanation for where Brexit came from, but also a government, a genuine conservative government that I would call it, that cut the budget deficit by 2/3, that got the country back to work, created millions of jobs and millions of new businesses. And I hope they can see that in spite of our current difficulties, there's a huge amount of strengths in Britain that we have not least because of some of the actions that the governments I led took. So I hope people will see that, and the aim is to be pretty frank about things I got wrong as well as things I got right. I mean, I'm all for, as President Bush once advised me, once you finish being Prime Minister, you want to leave the stage and let your successor get on with it. But at some stage, I think you have to write down what you were thinking, what you were trying to do, what you think now. It's a book that you can write. The historians will pore over every detail and will come to the conclusions they come to. But I think leaders should try and write down what they were up to and why, as it were, for the record.
And what a critical time for this book to be released, Mika.
The book is For the Record. David Cameron, thank you very much for joining us on Morning Joe this morning.
We greatly appreciate it.
And still ahead, while Democrats go full force on Trump's impeachment inquiry, Americans are still holding on one potential glimmer of bipartisanship: background checks. Up next, we'll talk to Democratic Senator Chris Murphy about the gun legislation talks sitting on the president's back burner. Morning Joe will be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.